Radley Balko, investigative journalist, a student of history, as he likes to say, but he's also a student of law enforcement and the military. And he has declared that Donald Trump, convicted felon in the Oval Office, Trump is trying to build his own paramilitary force. Balko likens it to things like authoritarian regimes in other countries. And when I heard that, when I read that, I was not only alarmed, but also the bells went off for me because it makes sense, right? If you want to run this country via a campaign of fear and intimidation, then one of the most effective weapons you can use is literally a weaponized force that is armed, that is masked, that is pretty much deploying your terror campaign at your best. So I sat down with Radley Balko because I wanted to explore that deeper with him. And I also wanted to explore what he is finding to be kind of the reception of local law enforcement to this new Trump 2.0 regime. And joining me now is Radley Balko, investigative journalist, the proprietor. I like that title. I like proprietor. Maybe I'll steal that from you. Proprietor of the amazing The Watch newsletter. I have been following Radley on Substack. I urge all of you to go and subscribe to his Substack. Also, a former WAPO person. We'll talk about that in a hot second when we deal with some free speech issues. And the author of the book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop. Radley, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, Radley, obviously, one of the most compelling and frankly titillating headlines I've seen affiliated with you is your statement that Donald Trump is trying to build his own paramilitary force. Before we get into some of the details of your take on that, can you explain to the viewers that are tuning in, what do you mean, or what does paramilitary mean?
Paramilitary just means a force that is not the kind of official military, the force that we send to fight wars. But it has a lot of characteristics of the military, and generally it's often used to talk about or to describe opposition groups in countries. So for a long time in Latin America, there would be the official regime, and then there would be paramilitary groups that were opposed to the regime, but would have sort of the guns and weapons and would sort of act like a military. But paramilitaries can also be used by authoritarians as a sort of quasi-official force. And we've seen this in pretty much every authoritarian country in the world. Every dictator likes to have their own muscle, right? The people that they can send in to do their personal bidding. And whenever that's happened, it does not turn out well.
Yeah, I want to quote you. I know that you had the chance to speak with Ezra Klein last month, and there was a quote that I pulled from that interview I wanted to read out loud and then follow up with a question. You said, "I'm a journalist, not a historian, but I'm a student of history," which I appreciate. You said, "There aren't very many countries in which the figurative political head of the country assembled his own personal paramilitary force that was loyal only to him, where things turned out well. So that's where I think we are right now." Radley, when you say where things turned out well, where they did not turn out well, you mean for the actual leader? Or do you mean for the people in the country where the leader deployed his own paramilitary force?
I mean, there are examples of both, but, when it doesn't turn out well for the leader, it tends to be because people rose up and there was conflict. And, this is... in this country, for a long time, we had a firm line, a firewall between the military and domestic policing. And one of the really healthy things about our democracy for most of our existence has been that the institution that's most opposed to using the military for domestic policing has been the military itself. There has been this ethos built in that, we do not deploy the military against our own people. In the 1980s, when the Reagan administration and actually some Democratic leaders in Congress wanted to bring the military in to fight the drug war, they wanted Marines, breaking into homes. They wanted the Navy intercepting ships. The main reason that didn't happen, and the Reagan administration did blur a lot of lines in this area, but the reason why we didn't have active duty troops fighting the drug war was opposition from the Pentagon itself. The Pentagon wanted nothing to do with that. And so what we've seen in the Trump administration, during his first term, he tried to do this. He wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. He wanted to bring the military in to shoot, literally, he claimed to want to shoot the George Floyd protesters. And it was opposition from Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, and from Esper, his defense secretary, that prevented him from doing it. And they've learned from that. So they've purged the Pentagon now of all the senior ranking generals who have been brought up through the ranks with that ethos. They're not there anymore. They purged the JAG Corps, the military lawyers who write rules of engagement, who basically set out what the military can and can't do under the law. One of the first things Hegseth did was purge those people, the senior ranking JAG officers from the JAG Corps, leading behind the people that they thought would be loyal and would carry out Trump's orders without questioning. So that's kind of where we are. They have, they have tried to destroy these norms, and these kind of, basic sort of principles and values of a democratic society, which goes back to the founding. The founders were very, very concerned about standing armies because they had looked at what happened throughout history, going back to Rome, when the military starts assuming a political role and a domestic role. And so they were extremely worried about that. They also saw what happened here in the U.S. when the British Crown stationed troops in the streets of Boston to enforce import laws. There was violence. And it was one of the big reasons why the American Revolution happened.
So I've often said, Radley, that Trump is like a hammer in search of a nail, especially when it comes to deployment of federal agents, federal military into American cities. Your thoughts, though, that there may not be adults in the room anymore in Trump 2.0, but there's still some adults maybe in the judiciary. For example, Judge Breyer out in California issuing his scathing ruling saying there have been clear violations of the Posse Comitatus Act, which people that are following and subscribing to this channel, we go to law school, I jokingly like to say. And they know that under Posse Comitatus, you cannot use federal law enforcement to do civilian law enforcement, or you can't use federal troops to be able to do civilian law enforcement. So your thoughts about the fact that at least there's a judge or judges that are saying that there are clear lines of legality?
Yeah. We've seen this in a lot of different areas, right? There are judges that have been willing to stand up to this administration, but they tend to be district court judges, the kind of lowest rung on the federal judicial ladder. And they're being, overturned, either by the appellate courts or by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now the U.S. Supreme Court, when it has overturned these, it's tend to be on these power grabs by the Trump administration. It's been on the, shadow docket. So they're not permanent rulings. They're sort of temporary rulings until they can consider the broader issues, but you're supposed to sort of consider who's likely to prevail on the merits in these cases. And so it's at least to kind of hint at where the court may be headed. But the other thing is, the Posse Comitatus Act prevents anyone from using the military for domestic policing, unless the president invokes the Insurrection Act. Then he can use it. And Trump has been reluctant to do that, I think, because of the political implications. But what they have tried to do is find these kind of workarounds. They've invoked laws that grant exceptions to presidential power in cases of national emergency or cases where there's a, major threat to public safety. In Los Angeles, what they did is they sent ICE and DHI and the FBI and all these other groups, ATF, in to do these mass deportations, which got extremely violent, which, they're snatching people off the streets. That's what they're doing in Chicago now. And when people protested, the administration claimed, well, we have to protect these agents from the protesters in order for them to be able to do their jobs. And the Ninth Circuit bought that. They bought that argument, even though several days before the Ninth Circuit ruled that, okay, yeah, we're going to go ahead and say that this is legitimate use of the National Guard. It's to protect ICE agents so that they can do their jobs. Several days before that, Kristi Noem said, in a press conference, that the real reason they were there was to liberate Los Angeles from its Democratic leaders. So, there is this other problem where they're making one argument in court, and then they're making their intentions very clear outside of court, and the courts only really listen to the argument they're making in court. And that's a problem because that's not how these policies are actually being enforced on the ground.
Yeah, and I am fond of saying we've got the court of law and the court of public opinion. And I guess one way we are seeing, though, Americans, everyday Americans who aren't signing on to this type of authoritarian regime that we're getting from Trump, one way you're seeing them pushing back is, for example, in Washington, D.C., the grand juries that are getting impaneled, they are not returning true bills. They are not returning indictments against people that have been arrested through the course of the deployment of federal, forces in the streets of D.C. So there is some measure of that rebellion that's happening, even though it's really shouldn't be construed as rebellion. I mean, it's just people that are saying we're seeing people's due process rights being violated in real time by masked agents, and we're not going to stand for it.
Yeah, and I think that I have found that very encouraging, and I think we need to continue to get the word out that this is a power that we have as citizens. We do not have to take the administration at its word when it claims that people have committed these crimes. There was an attempt, I think, in one case to charge. There was a case in DC where a delivery driver was beaten pretty severely as people were brunching nearby. And they tried to charge him with assaulting ICE officers, which would basically mean he was assaulting their feet, with his head. So you do not have to return indictments in these cases. And if it's a ridiculous prosecution, you can. And, I think that's encouraging. I also think it's really encouraging that we're seeing people pull out their cell phones every time they see ICE, get rough with somebody or try to, break somebody's windows and drag them out of their car. There has been this really striking dichotomy between everyday people with very little power. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Motorcycle going by. Everyday people with very little power who are willing to risk what they have to stick up for their fellow citizens. And at the same time, we're seeing these massive, powerful institutions who have the resources to actually fight back in a meaningful way are capitulating. And it's the regular people who are standing up to this administration. And, I take a lot of part in that. I'm really deflated about the collapse and the capitulation of the powerful. But, there are a lot of us. There are a lot of everyday citizens. And if we all refuse to kind of accept this administration's abuses of power, they're not going to be able to get away with it. It just, we do all have to kind of stand together and stand up.
One thing that you noted, Radley, is that there is a budget now that has passed in the big bullshit bill, as I call it, and it has created an incredible war chest. And I use the word war. I think it's appropriate in this context for ICE. It is $170 billion has been earmarked for that specific agency. It's not being given to the FBI to fight domestic issues. And it's not given to even individual law enforcement, which, again, the hammer in search of the nail, this idea that crime is surging and so crazy that you got to bring in the National Guard. Well, it's not like they're giving money to the cities to be able to combat crime, even though I also think that's a bullshit excuse. One thing you noted, which terrified me, and I want to share this with the viewers, and I want to kind of probe this with you, is the following. You talked about the kind of people that are being hired to do the work for ICE and these federal agencies. And I am a former prosecutor with a very close relationship with law enforcement. I have never called to defund the police. I am a big proponent of good, safe, smart, competent law enforcement. But you've said the people that the Trump administration is going to have to hire to be able to meet the goals that have been set, the quotas that have been set for ICE to achieve. You say these are pretty explicit appeals to white supremacy and white culture, and that people who are signing up for these jobs are watching what's happening across our country, and they're like, sign me up, coach, put me in. I mean, that terrifies me, Radley, because that, in my mind, you could have the best standard operating procedures, policies, laws, and yet I feel like that's just going to go by the wayside under the invocation of some bullshit emergency power.
Yeah, so I've been writing about law enforcement for more than 20 years now. It's what my first book was about kind of the militarized culture that has taken over too much of law enforcement. And one thing that I've written about pretty extensively and documented over the years is looking at the recruiting videos that police departments around the country send to colleges and high schools to, draw people into law enforcement. And there's been, over the time I've covered this, there's been a noticeable change in the tone of these videos from helping people and serving your community to videos of, blaring guitars in the background while cops sick dogs on people and rappel out of helicopters and kick down doors. And I think that's the same, dynamic that we're seeing at play right now at the federal level where, ICE is putting the administration, the DHS, social media feeds are putting out these images, of people, hunting down, immigrants, of, running through the streets, dragging people, shoving people down into the pavement. That's what they're using to recruit. And then they're mixing that with, DHS has also been putting out these pretty explicit appeals to white supremacy, right? They're invoking art that is well known and loved in the kind of white supremacist community as, glorifying white culture, Western culture. There was one tweet they put out that was a callback to a specific white supremacist book. The name escapes me right now. So, they're appealing to a very specific type of person. They're appealing to people who think that we're being invaded, who buy into the Great Replacement theory, and who want to take up arms, and, fight for what they think is their culture. And I think I agree with you. It's pretty scary.
But we have to give credit where credit is due, right? And I don't mean that in any positive way. I think one of the most effective things that Trump has done that he learned, it's like the machine learning, right? Which is also scary in and of itself. But Trump, I think, has learned that regardless of the support he's getting from SCOTUS, et cetera, and the courts of law, the propaganda works for him, right? Their propaganda seems to be some of the most effective that I have seen done. And part of the propaganda is them doing the crazy push on social media and doing the crazy Kristi Noem bullshit. I mean, all of that stuff is actually working, I think, because I do believe that there has been an uptick in the bloodlust in this country. And I do believe that it's stoking some of the basest, most cruel aspects of human nature for certain people. I guess considering the fact that you are a student of history and that you also have been embedded in this kind of law enforcement culture for so long, do you think, though, that people have always been this way, Radley, and this has just given them license, or so this is just the permissive structure they've been waiting for to happen? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a very profound and difficult question to answer. I think a lot of it has been giving people license. I think there's a phrase that Abraham Lincoln used that's been recited so often these days that it's almost become sort of cliche, but the better angels of our human nature. I think what this administration is doing is appealing to the more sort of nefarious devils of our human nature. It's saying it's okay to hate other people. It's okay to take pride in your own heritage and culture at the expense of others, of denigrating others, of seeing others as inferior cultures that need to be squashed or squelched. But, also I think that there is an explicit appeal, to people who see the, unwhitening of the country, and are, alarmed and feel threatened by that. Several years ago, I wrote about a black, police chief in Little Rock, progressive police chief who had been hired and was basically sort of run out of the city by the police union, because he implemented policies that try to undo some of the racially discriminatory policies of old. There's a white police union and a black police union in Little Rock, and the white police union was not happy with this guy and spread a lot of racist rumors about him. But one thing he told me when I was interviewing for the article I wrote was that when you have been the beneficiary of racially discriminatory policies your entire life, switching to a merit-based system to you is going to feel like discrimination, right? Because you're just used to getting these things because of your place and privilege in life. And when that's taken away and it's given to, a black candidate who probably is more qualified than you, or maybe is as qualified as you, is going to look like discrimination to you because that's not what you're used to.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting lens to look at it. I I also know that the Trump DOJ, as the traditional place, like the civil rights division of the DOJ, now under the helm of somebody like Harmeet Dillon, and the DOJ being run by Pamela Jo Bondi, like those were the types of agencies, federal agencies, that would make sure that pattern and practice discrimination was dealt with, that our law enforcement agencies would have to have consent degrees or consent judgments where they'd have to comply with fixing the problems that have been plaguing law enforcement for decades, to your point about your example of Little Rock. But we're not going to see that. So there's not going to be recourse for violations of people's civil rights when you have out of control ICE, et cetera. There's liability issues that I've covered. I mean, Radley, give us some hope, though. Again, you knowing kind of the inner workings on this, give us some hope, though, that there are still people, even internally, maybe in command structures within law enforcement, that are not going to sign on to do things that are either clearly illegal or are just anti-American.
So I could tell where your question was going, and I was formulating my answer in my head, and then you said, "Give us some hope," and that was not where my answer was headed.
Well, you don't have to bullshit us, though. But I mean, I'd like to know. Maybe the question should be: is there grounds for hope, Radley, that there are people that are not going to do things that are just squarely anti-American?
Right. So I think there has been a change in policing, particularly in urban areas and in large cities, toward more progressive, accountable, community-oriented policing. I think we're seeing that with a lot of police chiefs, particularly not exclusively, but particularly with police chiefs of color. There was a study out that showed that cities with black police chiefs have significantly fewer shootings by police officers than cities with white police chiefs. So I think at the state and local level, at least in some parts of the country, we are seeing an attempt to kind of change this culture within policing. The problem is, that's not at the federal level. And right now, the Trump administration was kind of imposing its will on cities around the country by sending these federal agents in. And, when it comes to accountability, and this is not a hopeful sentiment, but unfortunately it's where we are, there is no way to hold a federal law enforcement officer accountable for abuse or violations of the Constitution. Supreme Court, as you know, as an attorney and former prosecutor, there's a case called Givens in the 1970s that created a way for you to sue if federal law enforcement officers violate your constitutional rights. Supreme Court has basically destroyed that decision. They've all been eradicated. In fact, Brett Kavanaugh in 2022, in a concurrence, said, we should just admit that Bivens doesn't exist anymore. So, even state and local police officers, we talk about qualified immunity. It's a buzz phrase. It's thrown around a lot. And they are protected by qualified immunity, which I think is far too restrictive and makes it very difficult to sue them. But you can still sue them. When it comes to federal officers, there's really no way to go after them if they violate your constitutional rights. So the only way they can be held accountable is through the Justice Department by bringing criminal charges when they do something particularly egregious and unlawful. And, I think it's a pretty safe bet that this Justice Department is not going to be prosecuting any federal immigration officials, no matter, how violent or egregious or abusive they are.
Very quickly, before you and I part ways, I did want to ask you, I know you're currently working on a book about public defense and public defenders. As somebody who is a former prosecutor who has worked closely with public defenders and also done public interest law myself, I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of that system to work. But you did say that after Trump took office, a lot of people didn't want to talk to you on the record anymore. Pre-Trump, people were willing to have conversations with you post-Trump. I mean, that's a really kind of scary prospect that even people that are in the system, us, that we are lawyers, people that are a part of this. I mean, we've seen capitulation, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the bending of the knee by major law firms, for example, that have the literal wherewithal to fight this administration, bending the knee and kowtowing to this administration. But you're also finding that in the places where normally it's a kind of scrappy group of people that kind of against all odds are fighting.
Yeah, particularly in the area of immigration. And, of course, you're the Supreme Court has ruled that you're not entitled to a government-funded attorney for immigration proceedings, but there are jurisdictions around the country that provide one anyway, even though they don't have to. And those attorneys, especially, before Trump was reelected, were willing to talk to me about what they do and how the immigration courts and the criminal justice system overlap and what it means to represent somebody. And, a lot of times somebody will be brought in on a pretty relatively minor charge, and they'll be, the two will have to interact. The criminal lawyer will have to interact with the immigration lawyer. And so, I was exploring a lot of that for the book before Trump was reelected. And then afterward, with the way that this administration is going after, they consider providing legal defense for undocumented people, or for that matter, documented people who get caught up in the system, because that's happening too.
These days, yeah.
This administration considers that, facilitation of law breaking. They consider the mere representation to be illegal. There's a good chance that they're going to go after student loan forgiveness for people who go into immigration defense. So there's this effort to really undermine these groups. And, some of these groups also, they're worried about their funding being pulled if they're a nonprofit defense group, because the administration, as we saw yesterday, J.D. Vance said they're going to start going after funders. They're going to start going after foundations that fund groups that defend undocumented people. So, yeah, they are afraid to talk about what's happening on the record, and off the record, or on background, I guess I should say, they're terrified. They are furious by what they're seeing. They're furious on behalf of their clients, but they don't want to speak out because they don't want this administration to come after them.
Well, Radley Balko, you are not scared and you are speaking out. And I am grateful for providing such a great education for so many of us, and for you leaning into just the amount of time and research that you've spent getting and gathering this information about not only law enforcement and policing, but really kind of what we're facing right now in this present regime. I appreciate it. Everybody, Radley Balko, investigative journalist. And I'm going to steal this, the proprietor of the Watch newsletter. Go and follow him on Substack and read his books. Thank you so much for being here, Radley. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Haley. And thanks for all you're doing to speak out as well. It's important.
Thanks, my friend. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.